You already know from your study of bones the different regions of the vertebral column. The spinal cord is also split into regions with the same names. So we have here in the neck, the cervical region. Then in the chest area, the thoracic. Then next is lumbar. Then finally, sacral. So the names are the same, and in the cervical and thoracic, the location is the same. But you may notice that the lumbar and the sacral are a little different. So when it comes to the bones, your lumbar region goes from here down to here. So this is lumbar for bones, but lumbar for your spine is much shorter. It's just this little area right here. And when it comes to bones, sacral is down here. But sacral for your spine is up here in what's the lumbar region of the bones. So the reason for this is the way your body grows. You look here, we have a young child all the way up to an adult. Notice the head. In a baby, the head is 1/4 of the body. By the time you're an adult, the head is 1/8 of the body. Your brain and spine, your central nervous system, does most of its growing in the first few years. On a baby, the head is the biggest part. Your central nervous system hasn't really grown much since you were 5 years old. Now, it still develops a lot. So there's a difference between growth and development. Your brain is definitely still developing all through childhood and adolescence and even in the early 20s. But the actual growth, the increase in size, is pretty much done by the time you're 5 years old. So in an embryo and a fetus, the spine does go all the way down. So the spine and the vertebral column are about the same length, which the vertebral column is the bones. But then, as you go through childhood and adolescence, your bones are still growing. Remember, that whole puberty thing is when you have a big growth spurt. So the vertebral column continues to grow until your mid to late teens, whereas your spinal cord stopped growing when you were 5. Remember, it's the end of puberty when your epiphyseal plates grow and you stop, or your epiphyseal plates close and you stop growing taller. So as you go through adolescence and become your adult height, your vertebral column is getting longer, you're getting taller, but your spine is not getting longer. So the result of that is a spinal cord that is shorter than the vertebral column. So you have the tip of the spinal cord right here is called the conus medullaris. So this is a cone-shaped tip of the spinal cord. Then you have this bundle of nerves here that hang down. Now remember, at one point, the spinal cord would have been down in this area. But then as the vertebral column grew and the spinal cord didn't, those nerves kind of got pulled down. This bundle of nerves is called the cauda equina. If you're familiar at all with your Latin and Greek names, cauda means tail and equina means horse. So it literally means horse tail because it kind of looks like the tail of the horse, the way all those nerves hang down. Then with the spinal cord, you have nerves that emerge. So you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So you already learned the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Now you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And these emerge between vertebrae. And they go out then to connect your spinal cord to your effectors and to all your organs, your body parts. So the spinal nerves are named for the vertebrae. Okay, so if we do, let's do one color for bones, and then we'll do the same color for the spinal nerves as we have for the regions there. So let's use brown for the bones. So you have the very top bone is C1. That is atlas. That's the one that holds your head. Then you have C2 is axis. That's the one that your head pivots on. C3 and so on all the way down to C7. So you have 7 cervical vertebrae. Now here's the tricky part. You have 8 cervical nerves. The very top cervical nerve up here is C1. Then you have C2, C3, and so on. Down to the bottom one is C8. So C1 is between the atlas and your skull. Then C2 nerve is between your atlas and axis. Okay, then the C3 nerve is going to be between the axis and C3. So we have a pattern here. Here's C1, here's C2, here's C3, then your nerves, here's C1, C2, C3. Notice that the pattern is that the nerve is named for the bone below it. Then when we get to thoracic, so we're going to skip ahead here. So we have C7, so we'll just put some dots there. We skipped ahead. Then we go into thoracic. So then we have T1, T2, and so on. C8 is right here, between C7 and T1. Then we have T1, T2, do a couple more so you can see the pattern. So remember, brown is the bones. And then orange and purple are nerves. So now if you look at the pattern of naming the nerves once we get over to thoracic. This time the nerve is named for the bone below it. Or I'm sorry, for the bone above it. So basically you switch rules. You have two different sets of rules. In the cervical region, the nerve is named for the bone below it. The rest of the spine, it's a different rule. The nerve is named for the bone above it. C8 occurs at the transition between rules. So a lot of times it throws people off at first when they hear there's 8 cervical nerves because there's only 7 cervical vertebrae, but this is why. So the rest of the nerves match up with the number of vertebrae. So we're going to have T1 through T12 because there are 12 thoracic vertebrae. In lumbar, the nerves are still named for where they emerge. So you have your lumbar region of the spine, but then see here are the lumbar nerves coming out here. So you have L1 through L5 nerves. Sacral, you have S1 through S5. So here are the sacral nerves coming out from the sacrum. And then you have one coccygeal nerve, which is just CO1. So remember, the coccyx is the tailbone, so you have one little nerve that comes out there just above the tailbone. Another thing that goes along with how the spine is shorter than the vertebral column is where a lumbar puncture is done. So a lumbar puncture is also known as a spinal tap. And this is where you collect cerebral spinal fluid, and it's usually to diagnose a disease. Spinal taps are done. Notice here, here's the needle for the spinal tap. Here's L3, here's L4. They're done between L3 and L4. The reason for that, if you look up here, that conus medullaris, the tip of the spinal cord, is at L2. So if you take a spinal tap between L3 and L4, right here is the tip of the spinal cord. So this way you won't accidentally hit the spinal cord. So by taking it below the tip of the spinal cord, you make sure that you don't accidentally poke the cord. And this is not only spinal tap, but like if you get an epidural or a spinal injection, all of those are done there at the L3 and L4 to protect the spinal cord. Right? So there's the main parts of the spinal cord and the nerves that emerge from it. In the last video, you saw the 31 pairs of spinal nerves. We're going to look in more detail at that, where those spinal nerves emerge from the spine. So right here, this is a spinal nerve. And here it is on this side. So these are the structures that we saw emerging between the vertebrae. Now we're looking at a transverse section of the spine. So we're looking like from the top down into the spine. This is the posterior side. So this would be the part toward the person's back. And here is the anterior side. So this would be the part toward the person's front. Remember in chapter 12, you learned about the 4 functional divisions of the nervous system. You have somatic sensory, visceral sensory, somatic motor, and autonomic motor. The spinal cord is split into those 4 divisions. You have this area of the spinal cord is white matter. So this is all the axons that are running up and down to the brain. Then this butterfly-shaped thing is your gray matter. This is where your cell bodies are. And it's split into 4 sections. So this back part here that's teal colored is the posterior horn. This has the cell bodies for somatic sensory. Then the dark blue part is also posterior horn. And this is your visceral sensory. The orange part is the lateral horn. This is autonomic motor. And the red part is the anterior horn. And this is somatic motor. So those 4 basic types of functions of the nervous system are split up into their own areas of the spinal cord. And notice that the anterior side of the spinal cord has all of your motor function, and the posterior side has all sensory function. Then we have roots that connect the spinal cord to the spinal nerve. So these are your roots. You have a posterior root. This has sensory axons. Here is the anterior root. and it has motor axons. So you can just see the color coding here. You have the blue and teal in the posterior, and you have the red and orange in the anterior. Notice you have this swelling here on the posterior root. This is the posterior root ganglion. And it has the cell bodies of your sensory neurons. So these little bumps in here, those are cell bodies of the sensory neurons. Your motor cell bodies are all right here. So for your sensory neurons, you have the sensory axons come in like this through the spinal nerve. They go into the posterior root. You have a cell body right there in the posterior root ganglion. Then they continue into the spine and they go to the posterior horn. Then they synapse with other neurons there. For your motor, they have their cell bodies here in the spine, and then their axons go out through the anterior root and into the spinal nerve. The next picture is the same thing, just a different view. Now we're looking at a frontal view of the same thing. So here you can see the butterfly shape, that's your gray matter. And you're going to have your, right here is your posterior horn with visceral sensory. Somatic sensory on this one. Then right here would be posterior horn with visceral sensory. Then here is lateral horn with autonomic motor. And here is anterior horn with somatic motor. Then here is your anterior root. Here's your posterior root. Here's that posterior root ganglion. And then this part is your spinal nerve. In the next picture now, we zoom out a little bit. We're looking at this same picture but with a little more context. So now we have the bone. So here is your vertebra. And here you can see is your spinal nerve emerging between the vertebra. So this part right here is the spinal nerve. And you can see this little swollen area right here. That is that spinal root or posterior root ganglion. Okay, if we zoom in, you can see here is your posterior root, and here is your anterior root. And then here is the spinal nerve. So there's the parts you already know. And you can see here's that butterfly, the gray matter. It's going to have the anterior horn, lateral horn, and posterior horn. Now let's add in some more structures. From the spinal nerve, it starts to branch. This part is a posterior ramus. and it goes to the muscles and skin of your back. So this is the muscles of the back. So the posterior ramus is a branch from the spinal nerve. That innervates the muscles and skin of the back. Then you have this part is the anterior ramus. Many of your anterior rami go through a plexus, which we'll talk about soon. And then they go on. Notice it's larger than the posterior ramus because it innervates more things. Your anterior ramus, these are what are going to innervate everything on the front side of your body, your limbs, and your organs. So all the muscles and skin of your front, your limbs, and your organs. Then we have this part down here. These two little branches here are rami communicantes. And they lead out to this, which is a sympathetic trunk ganglion. This is a special path for your autonomic motor. So the autonomic motor neurons, axons, are going to come out of their lateral horn through this anterior root, through the spinal nerve, and then they're going to come like this through rami communicantes down here to the sympathetic trunk. Okay, so there's the part you'd see from a transverse view looking into the spinal cord with a little more context. You can see the spinal nerve emerging out between the vertebrae and what it branches into. Then I mentioned the plexus. So those anterior rami, many of them go to a plexus. So a plexus is a web of anterior rami. Okay, up here in the neck, this one is the cervical plexus. And the rami from it have nerves that come out that are going to innervate the head and shoulders. Then you have the brachial plexus. And just think of your words that you know. Brachial is arm. So these nerves are going to go to your arms. Then in the thoracic region, notice here, there's no web. They don't interweave. So there is no thoracic plexus. Instead, these are what's called intercostal nerves. And remember, costal means ribs. So these nerves run along the ribs. Then, as we continue to move down, we have the sacral plexus. This is going to go to your legs. Then we have, or I'm sorry, that one's the lumbar plexus. This one is the sacral plexus. The sacral plexus is going to go to the legs, feet, butt, and perineum. Then there are a couple of nerves that I want to mention. From the cervical plexus, you have the phrenic nerve. This nerve is important because it's what innervates your diaphragm, which is the muscle that makes you breathe. And from the sacral plexus, you have the sciatic nerve. This nerve is special because it is the largest nerve in the body. And you may have heard of sciatica. This is when you get painful pinching and swelling of this nerve. It's pretty common. A lot of people get this nerve pinched and irritated and inflamed, and it can be very, very painful to have sciatica. So these nerves, we will practice this more in class, understanding what happens as you emerge from the spine. But here's your introduction. We're going to look at the big picture and put some things in perspective and context of how the nervous system works and gets signals back and forth between your brain and body parts. So we're going to look at two sides here. We have sensory, which is going to be information to your CNS. And we have motor, which is commands from your CNS. And we're going to go through this scenario. We're going to use this example of this woman touches a hot pan. She feels that she touches the hot pan, and then she contracts her muscle to pull her hand away from it. With the sensory, it takes 3 neurons to get this message from her finger to the brain. The first neuron has a different structure than what we learned in chapter 12. That primary sensory neuron is a unipolar neuron. So a unipolar neuron it has dendrites. And the dendrites act as the sensory receptor. Then it has an axon. So you go straight from dendrites to axon. Then you have a little process here, and then your cell body. And then the axon continues, and then here's the part with the knobs that secrete neurotransmitter. So this is the structure that we're dealing with for our first sensory neuron. Dendrites straight to axon with the cell body off to the side, and then the knobs that secrete neurotransmitter. So our 3 neurons are primary, secondary, and tertiary. The primary one starts here in her finger. So right here in her finger are going to be those dendrites that act as the receptor. They're going to have gates that open in response to that feeling of heat, and that lets the sodium in and starts the action potential. Then the action potential travels up the axon. So this is the axon. It comes all the way up here to her spine. So remember, axons can be very long. So we have our primary sensory neuron has the dendrites, feel the heat. They open their sodium gates, and these are going to be called modality gates because they open in response to a sense. They start an action potential on an axon, and that goes to the spine. So if we look in detail here, here's that axon coming in. Right here is the cell body. And remember, this is the posterior root, and the cell body is in that posterior root ganglion. So remember, sensory goes to posterior. So this is the posterior root ganglion where the cell body is. Then we go into the posterior root, into the spine, and we go to the posterior horn of the spine. So when it gets to the spine, it goes through the posterior root, with the cell body in the posterior root ganglion. So this right here, this cell body, is what would be in that ganglion of the posterior root. And then it enters and it has its knobs in the posterior horn of the spine. And these knobs are now going to secrete neurotransmitter. So now we're ready for our next neuron, which is the tertiary neuron. I'm sorry, the secondary neuron. So the secondary neuron starts right here. It's receiving that neurotransmitter, and it goes up, and we cross over. Remember, the right and left cross over, so the right side of the brain is connected to the left side of the body and vice versa. And we go to the thalamus. So right here, you have your cell body. It's receiving that neurotransmitter, starting an action potential, and you go up to the thalamus of the brain. Remember, the thalamus is where your incoming sensory information comes into. So up here in this picture, let's see, our other one went through. So here is, we're back to that primary. We're going to finish the primary in this picture. Here's the cell body in the posterior root ganglion. We go into the posterior root, into the posterior horn of the spine. Now here is our secondary. Its cell body is receiving neurotransmitter in the posterior root. Its axon goes up, it crosses over to the other side, and it goes to the thalamus. So our secondary, the cell body receives neurotransmitter in the posterior horn of the spine. Then the axon goes up the spine. It crosses to the thalamus on the other side. And now its knobs will secrete neurotransmitter. So now we're ready for the third neuron. So this is the tertiary. Its cell body is in the thalamus, and it goes up here to the cerebral cortex. And here we can see it in this picture. There's its cell body in the thalamus. Its axon comes up, and it goes up there to the cerebral cortex. So the tertiary receives neurotransmitter in the thalamus. And remember, the thalamus decides what to ignore and what to pay attention to. Only things that it decides to pay attention to will continue on up to the cerebral cortex. So most signals don't make it past the thalamus. You can't pay attention to everything. Okay, now see how much you remember from chapter 13. This is touch. So which lobe and which part of that lobe do you think it's going to on the cerebral cortex? Think about touch. So this case, it's going to the parietal lobe and the somatosensory cortex, since she's touching something. And once the signal gets there to her somatosensory cortex on the parietal lobe, that is when she becomes consciously aware that she is touching that hot pan. Okay, now that she knows, she's going to contract her muscle. So we have the biceps here in her arm. She has to send a signal there to make that muscle contract and pull her hand away. So now we're ready to look at the motor side. The motor side has two neurons. The first one is called the upper motor neuron. Its cell body is here in the cerebral cortex, and it comes down. You're going to cross over, remember. You're going to go to the anterior horn of the spine. We can look at it in this picture also. Here's the cell body in the cerebral cortex. The axon crosses over. We come down here to the anterior horn of the spine. And again, think about what you learned about the brain. This would be the motor cortex on the frontal lobe. So when you make a decision to move a muscle, that begins with the upper motor neuron. Its cell body is in the motor cortex of the frontal lobe. And then the axon crosses over and then goes to the anterior horn of the spine. And now it's going to secrete neurotransmitter. So now we're ready for the lower motor neuron. So right here is the cell body, and then the axon goes out through the anterior root to the spinal nerve, and it would go out to the body part. So we can follow it up here. There's the cell body in the anterior horn. We go through the anterior root, and then this axon goes all the way down here to the muscle. And then this is where it's going to secrete acetylcholine to make that muscle contract. So the lower motor neuron has a cell body in the anterior horn of the spine. It receives neurotransmitter from the upper motor neuron. Then its axon goes through the anterior root out to the spinal nerve, and then secretes acetylcholine onto the muscle, and that makes the muscle contract. So there's an overview of your neurons. So it takes 3 sensory neurons to get the signal up to the brain. It takes 2 motor neurons to get the information out to the muscle. Another thing we can talk about here is IPSPs and EPSPs. So you remember those from chapter 12. Right here in the spine, where the upper and lower motor neurons communicate with each other, is where you have IPSP and EPSP. So whenever your brain wants the muscle to relax, the upper motor neuron secretes inhibitory neurotransmitter. And this will open the potassium or chloride gates, so that you reduce the voltage and you prevent an action potential in the lower motor neuron. So if there's no action potential in the lower motor neuron, then there is no acetylcholine on the muscle. And without that acetylcholine, the muscle stays relaxed. Then when your brain wants your muscle to contract, it has the upper motor neuron secrete excitatory neurotransmitter. This opens the sodium gates on the lower motor neuron. So then it has an action potential, and it does secrete acetylcholine onto the muscle. And the acetylcholine makes the muscle contract. So an upper motor neuron is always secreting neurotransmitter onto a lower motor neuron. So you have your upper, starts in the brain, it comes down, and then you have your lower, located in the spine, and it goes out, and then you would have your muscle here. Anytime that this is inhibitory neurotransmitter, then there is no action potential here, no acetylcholine here. So the muscle is relaxed. If you do have neurotransmitter here, excitatory neurotransmitter here, then you do have an action potential, you do have acetylcholine, and you contract. So whether or not you get acetylcholine and contraction depends on which neurotransmitter you're secreting onto that lower motor neuron. Now your brain coordinates activities between your antagonistic muscles. So remember, you learned that muscles come in antagonistic. For example, your triceps and biceps. Your biceps does flexion, your triceps does extension. They do the opposite of each other. So they move the same body part in opposite directions or opposite motions. Your brain coordinates this so that your muscles don't get in a fight with each other over your body parts. So for example, when your brain is telling your biceps to flex and pull your forearm up, it's purposely sending IPSP to your triceps. So if we do another scenario here, if you have your biceps here and your triceps here, they are antagonistic. So they each have their lower motor neuron. And they each have their upper motor neuron. If you're doing flexion, then you have EPSP here. So you would have IPSP here. And then when you're doing extension, it would reverse. So your brain coordinates so that these two muscles don't have EPSP. The muscle wouldn't have it, but so you're not sending EPSP to both of these effectors at the same time. I'm going through all this because there's a disease in which you lose that control. So you've probably heard of tetanus because hopefully you had your tetanus shot when you were a kid, but you might not know much about tetanus. Usually when I ask people about tetanus and say, what do you know about it? The first thing that comes to mind is rusty nails. Now, this is partially true and partially a myth. There's nothing about rust that is associated with tetanus. So the rust part is the myth. The nails part is kind of true because if you step on a nail, you get a puncture wound. And you tend to get tetanus from puncture wounds. Tetanus is your highest risk of getting tetanus from a puncture wound. So a little about tetanus. Tetanus is caused by a bacteria. It's called Clostridium tetani. This is an anaerobic bacteria. So it means that it only lives where there's no oxygen. And this might be surprising, but there's actually a good chance there's tetanus in you right now. It lives in your intestines. There's no oxygen in intestines. So it lives in animal intestines. And not just humans, all kinds of animals, and especially horses. Horses carry a lot of Clostridium tetani. So it lives just fine in the intestines where there's no oxygen, and it makes endospores. So an endospore is a tough, resistant form of the bacteria, and these endospores are in the feces. And then because animals poop outside on the ground, those endospores get in the soil. So basically, there are tetanus spores in the soil. If you get a puncture wound, and those spores get in it. So like one of the riskiest things you could do to get tetanus would be to be in a place where there's horse manure and get a puncture wound. That's your highest chance of tetanus, is a puncture wound near horse manure. There's no oxygen in a puncture wound. So like a scratch is less risk of tetanus because there's oxygen there. But in a puncture wound, there's no oxygen. And so those spores start to grow into bacteria. And these bacteria produce a toxin. And this toxin goes into your spine and goes to the anterior horn where your motor neurons communicate. Okay, so right here, we have your upper motor neuron and your lower motor neuron. And remember, this is where you have IPSP or EPSP. Well, if you have tetanus, tetanus turns off all of your IPSPs and it makes all of these synapses have EPSP. So this toxin from the tetanus will make all of the synapses between your upper and lower motor neurons have EPSP. So this thing up here where I said antagonistic muscles can't both have EPSP at the same time, your brain won't let them fight. Well, if you have tetanus, they're both EPSP. And both of these muscles contract. So then they do get in a fight with your body parts. So here's a picture of a man who has tetanus. That's what it looks like if every muscle in your body contracts at the same time. And this is called rigid paralysis. So he's paralyzed, he can't move, his body is stuck like that. And he's stuck like that because every single muscle is contracted. Tetanus is also sometimes called lockjaw because it starts in the jaw usually, and the jaw will close and it can't open because the muscles that close your jaw are stronger than the muscles that open it. And when those two muscles get in a fight over your jaw, the ones that close it win because they're stronger. So because you have all of these synapses, EPSP, every muscle contracts. Causing rigid paralysis. And the contractions can be so violent that you can actually break your own bones. So today, the good news is there is medical treatment if you get tetanus. It's not easy to treat. You might still spend a few months in the hospital. There's still a chance you could die from it, but it is possible to try and save you. In the old days, before medical treatment, not everyone who got tetanus died of it. It's always possible to survive, but a lot of people who got it died of it. And the only thing they could do for you was they would dig a pit and bury you with just your head sticking up out of the pit. And the reason for that was to try to stop those violent contractions that would end up breaking your own bones. Because if you're buried, you can't really move. So there is your motor neurons and sensory neurons and kind of the big picture of how all that works. Now we're going to look at a few maps of the body that correspond to your spinal nerves. This first one is a dermatome. Think of derm means skin. So this is showing areas of skin, and if you look at the labels on these areas of skin, they might look familiar, like T2, T1, L2, L3, L4. Those are the names of spinal nerves. So a dermatome is a map of the skin that shows which spinal nerve innervates each area of skin. And this is useful for assessing damage. You may have seen, or it may have happened to you, like you're in an accident and your back might be hurt, and they might poke you right here on your leg and say, can you feel that? And if you can't feel that, then you might have damage at the L4 spinal nerve. Or maybe if your fingers are numb, you might have damage at C8 or C7. So this is helpful for knowing which spinal nerve goes where, and that can help you check those spinal nerves. Another thing that can happen is phantom pain. This is when a person can feel pain in a body part that is no longer there. So this is common for people who have had an amputation. So if you think about those sensory neurons, remember the primary sensory neuron would come up, you would have that axon comes all the way up, it goes into the posterior root, and you have the cell body in that posterior root ganglion. So this is our primary sensory neuron. And it has its cell body in the posterior root ganglion, which remember is right next to the spine. And then there it connects with the secondary, which goes up to the thalamus, and then from there, the tertiary, which goes up to the somatosensory cortex. So here is your somatosensory cortex on the parietal lobe. And remember, it has a map of the body. So right here, it has a section dedicated to the foot. Now, if you get an amputation, so in this picture, the person's leg has been amputated, and it shows that they're still feeling pain in the foot. When you get an amputation, you cut off the axon of that primary sensory neuron. But as long as the cell body of a neuron is alive, then the neuron is still alive. So the cell body of this neuron is still alive in that posterior root ganglion next to the spine. Now also, when you get an amputation, your somatosensory cortex does not know about that. So here, the somatosensory cortex with the map of the body does not know that that body part has been amputated. So as far as it's concerned, you still have a foot because it still has a foot on its map. So then you can still get signals going up that pathway and to that spot on the map. So because this cell body is still alive, it can still send signals to your somatosensory cortex. And your somatosensory cortex has no idea that you don't have a foot anymore. It gets those signals go to its spot on its map where the foot is, and it feels pain in the foot. And this pain is just as real as the pain from somebody who does still have their foot. The brain, the part of the brain that feels pain, doesn't know the foot isn't there. So the pain is just as intense and just as real as if you did have a foot that was being injured. Another thing that can happen with pain is referred pain. Your internal organs share sensory pathways with areas of skin. A common example is pain in the left arm during a heart attack. A lot of people know to watch for that as a symptom of a heart attack. So if we look at this picture, here's your heart, and you can see here's its neuron. Sensory neuron comes in, you go through the posterior root, there's the cell body in the posterior root ganglion, and you go to the posterior horn in the spine. Here is the skin of the left arm. Its axon comes in, goes into that same posterior root, has its cell body in that ganglion, goes into the posterior horn of the spine. Notice there's only one neuron here. They both synapse onto that same neuron, and this is the neuron that goes up to your brain. So whenever the skin is hurt and it sends a signal, your brain gets the signal from the skin on this neuron. When your heart is hurt and it sends a signal up to your brain, it's the same neuron that carries the heart signal. So when your brain gets the signal, it's not entirely sure if it came from the skin of your left arm or your heart, because they both share the pathway. So your brain can't distinguish which sent the signal. And most often, when your brain gets a signal from an internal organ, it will assume that your skin sent it. Your skin has been sending pain signals your whole life, ever since you were a baby. Not very often does an internal organ send a pain signal. So your brain is used to your skin being the one that sends these signals. So your brain will assume that your skin sent the signal. So, although pain in the left arm is a common sign of a heart attack, there's actually nothing wrong with the left arm. You're having a heart attack, your left arm is perfectly fine. It's not actually sending a pain signal. It's just kind of been framed for sending a pain signal. So there is nothing wrong with the skin. It is kind of falsely accused of being in pain, or it's been framed. But knowing this is helpful to diagnosing problems. So we know which areas of the skin share pathways with which organs, and we can use that to help diagnose problems. So again, with the heart attack example, everybody knows that the left arm is a sign of heart attack. Another example, if you look here, the liver and gallbladder, and that goes around onto the back there also. So for example, I once had some trouble with my gallbladder, and every time I ate, I would get this stabbing pain in my shoulder blade. So I went to the doctor, and all I said was, every time I eat, I get this horrible stabbing pain in my shoulder blade. And immediately my doctor said, oh, it's probably your gallbladder. Another example is the appendix. If your belly button hurts, that's a sign of appendicitis. So knowing these areas of pain can help you figure out which organ is having a problem. Now we can look at reflexes. A reflex is a pre-programmed involuntary response to a stimulus. So this means that something happens to you and you have receptors that detect this something that happens to you. Then your sensory neurons send a signal. And then you have a response to this. So then your motor neurons will carry a command to your effector for a response. And this just happens automatically. You don't think about it. You don't consciously decide to do it. That's the involuntary part. It comes from the subconscious, either parts of your brain, or some reflexes occur just in your spine and don't even involve your brain. And reflexes are classified two ways. One of those ways is by the number of synapses. So remember, a synapse is where one neuron meets with another neuron. So we could have a sensory. So remember, sensory neurons are going to come in through the posterior root. They're going to have their cell body in the posterior root ganglion. And then they're going to come here into the posterior horn. You could then have a motor neuron that receives the neurotransmitter from that sensory. And then its axon goes out the anterior root and to the effector. So here is your sensory. Here is the motor. And you have one synapse right here. So that would be a monosynaptic. So the first way here, first type of reflex is monosynaptic. This means you have one synapse where the sensory neuron secretes neurotransmitter to stimulate the motor neuron. This is the fastest type of reflex. You cut out the middleman. You just go straight from sensory to motor. Another type is the polysynaptic. So we have our sensory comes in, cell body in the posterior root ganglion. We come here. Then we have an interneuron. And then the motor neuron. So this one uses an interneuron. An interneuron is a neuron that is entirely in the CNS. No part of it leaves the central nervous system. So now here you have synapse number 1, synapse number 2. So this is a polysynaptic. So this is where the sensory gives the information to an interneuron, and then the interneuron is what secretes neurotransmitter onto the motor neuron. So this one is a little slower because synapses slow you down, and this one has to go through 2 synapses. The other way we can classify the reflexes is by sides of the body involved. Both of the examples I've drawn so far are ipsilateral. Because the stimulus and the response occur on the same side of the body. The other type is contralateral. Contralateral involves both sides of the body. And when I say sides here, I'm referring to right and left. So if we go up here, let's draw a contralateral one. A contralateral, you would have your sensory coming in, and then we would have a motor that comes out this way. So if this receptor and the sensory information is on one side and the motor response is on the other side, that is your contralateral. Okay, now we can go through 4 examples of reflexes in the body. And this information is going to help you in lab because you're going to test some of these reflexes in lab. So the first one is withdrawal. This is just when you pull away from pain. Right? Like you touch something hot or you touch something sharp and you automatically jerk away from it. The second one is crossed extensor. This is the contralateral reflex. It involves both sides of the body, and this occurs in your lower limbs. And this is what's being shown in the pictures up here. In crossed extensor, he hurt this foot, so he had pain here. Because he's then doing the withdrawal reflex, pulling that foot away from the pain, this leg has a crossed extensor reflex. It has to support your whole body. If you didn't have the crossed extensor, you would fall down. So crossed extensor occurs in your lower limbs, and it is when one leg supports the body while the other has a withdrawal reflex. And the whole point of the crossed extensor is so you don't fall down. If you didn't have this, you'd fall down every time you stubbed your toe. The third one is the stretch reflex. This is when a body part is pulled on. Think about carrying something heavy, right? Like you're carrying a gallon of milk. That pulls on your muscles and your joints. Even if you're just holding the milk down at your side, it pulls on your muscles and joints. And you don't want to pull your joints out of socket. You don't want to tear your muscles. So whenever you pull on a body part, the muscle tightens up. So you can try this. You can hold a heavy object and just let it hang by your side, but you're holding on to it, and feel your muscles. You'll feel they're all tightened up because they're making sure you don't pull your joints out or tear your muscles. And the fourth one is the Golgi tendon reflex. This one is kind of the opposite of the stretch reflex. This inhibits you from using your full strength. You are actually stronger than you realize. So you're only using maybe about 60% or so of your full strength in daily life. Your brain purposely inhibits you from using your full strength. This is because if you did use your full strength, you would hurt yourself. Remember the people with tetanus? Their muscles would contract so violently they could break their own bones. If you went around using your full strength, you would damage your bones, you would damage your tendons, you would hurt yourself using your full strength. And the Golgi tendon reflex is what inhibits you. When it feels that your tendons and your ligaments are being pulled too much, so when it feels that your tendons are pulling, it acts to make your muscle back off. It kind of inhibits your muscle from contracting anymore. And this is where you may have heard stories of, like, in extreme life or death situations, people get super strength, because in a life or death situation, you can override this and use more of your strength. And I have a funny story about this. My friend Laura went through a phase where she was really into chickens. And she went and bought this very expensive, fancy chicken. And she had to drive several hours to get it. And she's on her way home with this chicken in a cage in the back of her truck. And she just spent like hundreds of dollars on this chicken. And she's in McDonald's having lunch, and she looks out the window and she sees that the chicken has gotten out of its cage and it is perched on the side of the truck ready to jump out and into the highway and get hit by a car. So she panics. She goes running out of McDonald's into the parking lot, jumps into the bed of the truck, doesn't stop to climb in or anything, just leaps and makes it into the bed of the truck, grabs the chicken, gets it back in the cage, saves the day. But it's hilarious because she is not an athletic person at all. And if you were to offer her $1 million, there's no way she could make that leap into the back of the truck again. She just saw her chicken about to get ran over, and she panicked, and she overcame this Golgi tendon and used her full strength.